What's up, freaks? This rip was brought to you by River. River's a Bitcoin company built by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners the right way. There's no trusted third parties. They build all their infrastructure. They have free DCA because they know it's the best way to buy Bitcoin. So if you want to buy Bitcoin, you want to mine Bitcoin, you want to send Bitcoin over the Lightning Network, you want to plug into their Lightning Network API. If you're a developer, they're building all these tools for you. They also encourage self-custody. Again, they're Bitcoiners. They want to provide an on-ramp for you and then teach you and encourage you to take control of your own Bitcoin. And they're doing this. It's a beautiful company. If you do hold Bitcoin on the exchange, you can know for sure, since they don't rely on any third parties, they don't lend your Bitcoin out, they don't speculate with your Bitcoin. Your Bitcoin is held in a multi-sig wallet with 100% reserves. Okay? So go to river.com/TFTC, take advantage of the no-fee DCA. You set up your dollar cost average. You don't pay any fees on those buys. If you're a developer, they have their Lightning Network Services API that you can build on. You can send over Lightning. You can mine via River as well. You may have your exchange. You may be comfortable with it, but have you tried River yet? It's a question you have to ask yourself. If the answer is no, go try it. That's where all the Bitcoiners are hanging out. That's where I get my Bitcoin as well. River.com/TFTC. Thank you guys for listening. If you're listening on YouTube, please subscribe, set the notifications up as well. We're going to be putting out a lot of content this year. If you want to subscribe to the podcast feed as well, if you're not around your computer or not listening on YouTube, but you want to catch the podcast on the podcasting feeds, subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. And if you want to learn more about Bitcoin, I write a newsletter almost daily during the week. Go to tftc.io, subscribe on the website, and you'll get pure signal on Bitcoin, macroeconomics, geopolitics, whatever tickles my fancy that day. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for supporting the show. If you can subscribe, rate, review, goes a long way. We're trying to blow this up in 2023. Enjoy the rip.
We're going. Dan Gould, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Marty.
Well, thanks for joining. I'm very excited about what you're working on. You recently released the Payjoin Development Kit to make it easier to integrate Payjoins into Bitcoin wallet software, just Bitcoin projects in general. And Payjoin is something, Payjoin, pay to endpoint, whatever you want to call it, is something I've been writing about in the bent for at least 4 years now, and something that we've talked about on Rabbit Hole Recap and TFTC many times throughout the years. And I think it's something that's very important, but for some reason or another, it hasn't gotten a lot of adoption since it's been available to people. So I guess before we jump into Payjoin and the development kit that you're building, why don't we learn a little bit about you, your history in Bitcoin, and why you decided to focus on this one area with Payjoin specifically.
Sure thing. I started in Bitcoin development in late 2016. I was really fortunate. So I found Bitcoin on the internet and interested in it as money, of course, as we all are. And when I was in college, I found Tumblebit on Reddit and looked at the byline, which was Ethan Haleman. So Tumblebit's one of these privacy protocols, early days, 2016. And Ethan at the time was my teaching assistant, or he was the teaching assistant for my probabilities class. So my mind was just totally blown that like real people actually worked on this stuff that I could go talk to. So during winter break, I had the opportunity to go into the lab and work on Tumblebit. I really wanted to contribute to open source, and Bitcoin captivated my attention. And I just made a really crappy PR to change configuration settings on that. And that turned into this whole, journey down the rabbit hole and multiple open source projects and focus on Bitcoin privacy. So from there, we went to Stratus in the UK. They wanted to implement Tumblebit, but this was before the 2019 FinCEN guidance on what you can and can't do with Bitcoin privacy. So that kind of ties into what's going on with ARC now and which privacy protocols work and don't work. So out of that group that was working on Tumblebit came Wasabi. And Nicholas went on, he was working on that too, and he went on to work on BTC Pay. So I was traveling at the time and using iOS for Bitcoin, and was really disappointed I couldn't use Wasabi for that. So I forked Wasabi into Chaincase, which is an iOS app that does some CoinJoins. Kept thinking, okay, does this really solve the problem? Does this really solve the problem? I don't think the application level solves the problem doing it in an iOS app. I don't think iOS users are the reason we don't have Bitcoin privacy, is what it comes down to. So started collaborating with some of those developers that were working on Wabi Sabi and looking at it more from a systems perspective when I realized Payjoin is a really simple protocol that gives you reasonable privacy, and it's incredibly convenient because it works just like a naive Bitcoin transaction would from a user's perspective. And started learning Rust, and that turned into the Payjoin Dev Kit. And the point of that is that rather than create a piece of wallet software that has privacy, let's just bring privacy by default to all of the Bitcoin software and services that exist.
Yeah, and you mentioned FinCEN guidelines that were clarified in 2019. What did those guidelines say explicitly? Like what type of structure did that give builders?
So I don't have it directly in front of me, and I'm not a lawyer, but the overarching theme was if you're not able to unilaterally spend someone's money, then you're not a money service business, which means you don't need to apply for licenses. And it means you're a networking business. So you can run a regular software company and be a transaction coordinator, like a atomic swap coordinator or a CoinJoin coordinator, and you're in compliance with the law. So that let all sorts of privacy innovations happen as long as you don't have that custody of user funds, which is awesome because it means that users can get this help from the cloud, if you want to call it that, and their clients can still have really excellent privacy guarantees.
Mm-hmm. And so to take like a broader view on this, is like CoinJoin more generally as sort of a transaction type to create better privacy assurances for users as they transact on the network. I'm sure many people who have listened to TFTC and Rabbit Hole Recap understand CoinJoins quite a bit, but for anybody maybe new to the show, what is a CoinJoin? How have implementations like Join Market, Wasabi, and Samurai implemented it to date, and how does Payjoin differ in the way that they're doing it?
Yeah, I was listening to you and Matt on RHR yesterday get into a little bit of how Payjoin might be a complement to these things, and it's not a replacement per se. So when we're talking about Bitcoin transactions, we know that those transactions don't come from accounts. Your Bitcoin wallet isn't so much an account as it is a collection of keys that can spend entries in the Bitcoin ledger, because anytime someone pays you, they're making a transaction and you get an output that your key can unlock. So because it's not accounts, you have some pseudonymity, but there are naive ways that most wallets will spend Bitcoin. And when you do that, it's very easy to track all of your behavior, your balances, and you can put a target on your back, which is, dangerous if someone wants your Bitcoin. So CoinJoin fixed that problem partially by having multiple people come together and make equal outputs at the same time, so that someone looking through the history comes to a CoinJoin and they're not sure which one of those equal outputs belongs to you or the other participants in the CoinJoin. There's a whole boatload of caveats about how you spend after that can deteriorate that privacy, but in general, if you look at the one CoinJoin, the idea is that all of the participants have forward-looking privacy, meaning no one, once someone gets tracking back to that coin join, everything in front of that is unrelated to everything behind that.
Yeah, and you mentioned this in the blog post announcing PDK, which is essentially what CoinJoins are trying to do. It's funny because you're using an output as an input in a new transaction, and so by doing a coin join, you're essentially corrupting the common input ownership heuristic used by chain surveillance companies that try to track you across the ledger. So if you buy from an exchange and send to a wallet, the wallet basically uses that common input ownership heuristic to assume that you control that wallet. And then as you spend forward in time from there, they sort of use that to track you. And so CoinJoin sort of corrupts this heuristic, correct?
CoinJoin corrupts the heuristic, and also because you have equal amounts, which is how Join Market, Wasabi, and Samurai operate, you have not only ambiguity in where the inputs came from, like did they all come from the same user or not, but you also have that multiplied by a number of people that participate. So your coin becomes one of all of the participants in the coin join, and then assuming the implementation is done cleanly, the rest of all of the other people who do coin joins that spend from your source coin join. As it relates to Join Market's cool because there's not fixed output amounts. So you can make a payment of your specified amount, and then all of the peers that join you in that coin join, you pay them to participate, and they make your decided equal amount, which is great because it's kind of like a pay join in that you spend and you don't have to worry after that you have this change amount. Because you're making equal amounts with a coin join, you end up with this change amount that's still linked to the original history. And Wasabi and Samurai, at least Wasabi version 1, just do something slightly different where everyone has the same output amount, so everyone gets change. And Wabi Sabi with Wasabi v2 try to fix this by allowing any, not necessarily any amounts, but they break down the amounts in the outputs based on the input to try to reduce the amount of change. But all of these still suffer from some, both the knowledge that you know that it's a what's called a mix, meaning all of the inputs and all of the outputs are the paying themselves. And with Join Market, you have all of those other takers who took the maker's payment amount. They don't have an incentive to keep that new amount. Their incentive is to join more Join Market transactions. So you can kind of figure out who made the payment and who was a maker down the line. There's not a ton of protection from that. And in Wasabi 2, even though you create all of these different amounts, the person who put the greatest input still has the greatest output set. So you can do, it's computationally expensive, but if someone were targeted, you could still target one of those participants and figure out a likely set of their outputs and over time break that down. Samurai tries to stay to the zero link. Everyone has the same amount. Everyone has these same spending conditions, which you still get that change. That their solution is just never spend the change, or some people use swap services and stuff, which is expensive. But really, I think the key point is that they all still have this change problem, whether they say it or not, and you don't have assurances for arbitrary amounts that your inputs and outputs are unlinked. And if you do multiple inputs, the inputs are unlinked, and if you have multiple outputs, the outputs are unlinked. And this is where Payjoin really makes a difference. Payjoin, because you have a payment amount, you have the potential to break all of those links. You're not depending on the equal output amount. You have a potential to get rid of all of it because you're making no change.
Yeah, that seems pretty massive because the change that you mentioned is commonly referred to as doxic change in the community because it's toxic to an extent because it can dox you. if you commingle that change with an output produced um, while you're coin joining or at the end of the coin join. And yeah, so like let's dive into how Payjoin really reduces that threat of the dox exchange, because it's a really cool way. And if you're successful, when you are successful, Zach confident here in getting PDK to the point where it can easily be implemented in many wallets. Like the ideal scenario is that you're just spending and doing pay joins as you spend, and just unknowingly increasing your anonymity set as you spend your Bitcoin. Maybe not your anonymity set, but your better privacy assurances as you're spending.
Anonymity set is a really interesting thing to talk about, though, because that really comes from mixnets. That comes from network privacy. Back in the early aughts, this paper came out where they're working on anonymizing network traffic, and network traffic doesn't have an amount associated with it, really. Network traffic is just packets. And so if you have an anonymity set of people browsing the internet, for example, that's the number of people that the traffic could potentially originate from. With Bitcoin, at least with Chaumian CoinJoins, with zero-link CoinJoins, this idea has been borrowed and adopted. So if everyone has the same amounts, we can think of this anonymity set in isolation in one transaction, but it kind of breaks down when you look across a bunch of transactions with this dox exchange problem. So I don't think it's a harm. I'm glad we are using some sort of measure, but I think it's imperfect. And when I think of Payjoin, I don't really think of anonymity sets so much as ambiguous interpretations. Like, how many interpretations could you imagine a certain output has? How many people this could have come from, but also like how many different trees of transactions, how many different histories is this associated with? And because you don't have those equal amounts, because you're paying someone. So Payjoin is just two people, at least in its current iteration. Payjoin, BIP78 Payjoin, is when a sender and receiver combine two transactions into one. You have the sender wants some privacy, and the receiver is open to consolidating some of those outputs together, so they spend fewer outputs when they spend later on. Because they contribute input to the transaction with the sender, they consolidate what would otherwise be two outputs, their previous output and their incoming payment from the sender, into one. And the payment amount, because it's combined, is hidden. It's not explicit on the chain. The payment amount is the old input from the receiver plus the payment and some change. And you can set up the input amounts and the output amounts so that someone looking both doesn't know it's a pay join, and they also don't know which one of the outputs includes a payment.
Yeah, and that's, again, pretty massive if it can become widely used and popular. And I guess this is a good point to jump into why it hasn't received as much as adoption as many people like myself would like. And I imagine that revolves around the need for the receiver, who needs to put up an input, with the sender to have essentially a hot wallet and an always-on server that enables them to essentially create inputs in these pay-join transactions.
Yeah, having a hot wallet to always contribute an input and being available all the time to add that are definitely the biggest barriers, but I think we can get around both of them. So because you're contributing an input right now, you need to have a server that's online that receives a proposal and can respond with an updated pay join. And this is kind of similar to CoinJoin, where everyone that's participating is online and talking to a central server to figure out everybody else's intent. Payjoin, BIP78 Payjoin V1 solves this by having the receiver run a HTTP server that you can make those requests to and it can respond to, which is great because HTTP is everywhere. We're using HTTP to have this call right now. It's ubiquitous versus something like CoinJoin, which is a custom protocol that you need a whole network stack in your app to use. So you need kind of custom apps. It's a huge dependency to add. The only application besides a CoinJoin specific app that has this, as far as I know, is, well, there are two. It was BTC Pay Server and Sparrow. There are like different versions of some of the CoinJoin apps, but most of them are just CoinJoin apps. Because there's an incentive, though, for the coordinator, I think CoinJoin has been able to skirt around this. They've been able to get teams together, they've been able to raise money, and they've been able to deploy these standalone wallet apps because there's that incentive where, okay, if we deploy this, we're going to make a lot of money, and everyone wants to make money. Versus Payjoin, there is a small incentive for the sender who gets privacy and the receiver who can do that consolidation, basically batching to save fees later on. But that hasn't really been enough to convince companies to take it on because it's difficult. There hasn't been any library software to do it. And I don't think anyone had explored before recently what that idea of batching that can be done with CoinJoin really does. There's this whole idea of transaction cut through that Greg Maxwell came up way back in the day, where if multiple people propose transaction intents before they post them and they can interact, then you can get rid of some steps in a transaction process, which gives you privacy, like how Payjoin gets rid of the payment amount. And you can also do a lot of cool stuff by reducing the number of steps it takes to open a Lightning channel, or even for services to batch transactions that are incoming. Instead of just batching a bunch of withdrawals, you can do those and also pay them with incoming sats without ever having to take those sats into custody first. There's like a whole unexplored territory. So yeah, basically we remove that hot wallet and server requirement through something. There are a bunch of tricks we can use to do that, but also I think telling the story of how this fee savings can be so great could also really help Payjoin adoption. So these are all on the roadmap and mentioned in the blog post, but it has been a real difficulty.
Yeah. I mean, and the fee saving thing was, you mentioned that you listen to Matt and I discuss this on Rabbit Hole Recap, and you mentioned it in the blog post too. Is it really only fee saving for transactions like Lightning channel openings, or does it go beyond that for other use cases as well?
It goes beyond that for other use cases. So the Lightning one is probably the easiest one to understand because it gets rid of a whole transaction in a typical flow. To understand this, we got to go into the Lightning funding transaction flow. So let's say your buddy sends you some sats and like in a UTXO on chain, and you want to open a Lightning channel, you would have to send those sats to your Lightning node, wait for a confirmation, and then propose a channel open and open another transaction with a Lightning peer. With Payjoin, because it's interactive, you can propose to send some sats to your Lightning node, like your buddy who pays you, and the response can include an output that is the channel open with your peer. It can just replace that original intent. So the only transaction that actually gets posted is funded by your buddy and opens a Lightning channel. This is like without even channel batching. This is just you skip a whole transaction, but you can also batch transactions with that. That's the idea of transaction cut through. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so you're essentially cutting one step out of the Lightning channel setup process, because if you're opening a channel in the first place, you're going to want two-way liquidity. So you would have made that transaction anyway, correct?
Yeah, you would always need to you always need a new output that's the channel output. So either you take a single sig into your own custody first, or you get rid of that step by communicating with networking instead of communicating using the chain. And this is the idea isn't limited to Lightning channels. That could be used for an exchange too. Like an exchange could queue up a withdrawal. Say one of the users wants to take sats out of the exchange. They could say that, and the exchange could say, okay, that's going to happen sometime during the day. And if they get a Payjoin coming in, rather than putting those sats coming into the exchange's address, they can just put those sats directly into their withdrawal and take the excess as change into the exchange. Because the Payjoin proposal includes like a fallback transaction that doesn't have to necessarily get posted, that can always be updated with any number of payments to a withdrawal, or say they wanted to pay a bill, or they wanted to open Lightning channels. You can really extend this cut through idea quite a bit, where both sides can now be batched. Instead of just an exchange batching a bunch of withdrawals, they can also batch their inputs funding withdrawals, which is a huge problem when the block space market becomes expensive. A lot of the times exchanges just run out of UTXOs that aren't confirmed to pay withdrawals.
Yeah, I mean, that's massive. I mean, you can make the argument like this is a great way to reduce the amount of times necessary to touch the chain for service providers, whether you're running a Lightning company or an exchange. So is this why, after I posted that newsletter earlier this week, Francis was getting all excited? Is that how he's thinking about implementing it in Bull Bitcoin?
Yeah, he really gets it. He's gotten it for a long time, but like there hasn't been a Payjoin receiver that works with their Cypher node backend. There's been the BTC Pay server one, but there hasn't been any way to connect it to Bitcoin D or connect it to LND, and that's what PDK allows. That's what improves it more than anything else. We do need, and it's great for an exchange because they're running a server all the time anyway. There's definitely a way to get rid of that server requirement, or have someone else run a server for you, kind of like how offline Lightning payments would work. It's very similar. But for someone like an exchange, as long as you have the software that works, it is a great cost-saving thing. And the other thing Matt mentioned was the difficulty of sending a transaction. The cool thing is Payjoin version 1 was engineered around the Bitcoin URI standard. So the experience from a user's end is the same. If the wallet supports it, it'll just send Payjoin when you scan the QR or tap NFC or paste the URI. You don't have to put your funds into Lightning and then use Lightning. You don't have to put your funds into a CoinJoin app and then use CoinJoin. It just works.
So the receiver essentially would initiate it, and the end user may not even know that they're engaged in a Payjoin unless they are hyper cognizant of fees. Is that correct?
Right. The receiver adds a little more data to the address they would post anyway, and the sender's wallet, if it supports it, can use that, and otherwise can just ignore it.
Yeah. This is fascinating. And so turning back to like the server, which is really interesting, you posted on the Bitcoin Dev mailing list earlier this year, I believe in January, if my memory serves me correctly here, about solving this always-on server for the receiver problem with something called a turn server, a turn relay. What is this concept?
Yeah, I think linking to that mailing list might cause some confusion, because that was like the first version of it where I put it on the mailing list to see if there was interest in the idea or not. A turn is a very old way of getting two computers that don't host servers to talk to each other using a relay. So this is assuming they're on all the time, and the receiver negotiates with a relay, and then that relay, if the sender connects to that relay, the relay can talk to the receiver. I don't necessarily think this is the best way to go forward, because there's actually huge improvements in relays over the past couple of years. Like Nostr, obviously, we relay media, and that gets around censorship in a huge way. But also there's these two things. There's two pieces of technology. One is called oblivious HTTP, which is kind of like Tor without all of the complexity of a consensus network, and this idea called mask, which is like turn reimagined. It's a much easier way to do relay server, and both of these are supported by iOS 17, and they're advertised as privacy features. So Turn is like complex and a lot already supports it, but the cool thing about having OHTTP and mask in operating systems is that we can, again, use this Payjoin Dev Kit in all of these different wallets and expect that these relay softwares will already exist. So I'm not like sold on Turn. Turn is one way of having a relay. And that at that time was a good way to understand, for me, to put into words that we're going to use a relay to get rid of the requirement to run a server, but it could be any number of different relay tech. It could be Nostr. You could do that.
That would be fascinating if you could. And just like dive deeper into this, like what is leveraging this type of relay infrastructure, regardless of which one it ends up being. Like, why does it make it easier?
Well, I think we should settle on one relay in a standard, because then all the software can talk to all the other software. When we're saying just put a relay here, no one adopts it, no one has interoperability, and that's kind of what we have now. In the original BIP 78, there's actually this idea of an unsecured Payjoin server where you make a Payjoin using a relay, but that relay is trusted not to share your information. They can still see stuff. And Stowaway in Samurai and Sparrow also does relayed Payjoins, but through Tor and without a public specification that was built using a collaborative process. So it's just really hard for wallets to use those technologies because they need to build something proprietary that, like, an exchange could do it between their exchange app and their exchange, but beyond that, it would be really difficult to actually roll out. And the idea of serverless Payjoin would be to come up with a standard that all different wallets could implement. I think Mask is probably the best way to do that right now. You create an application that the specific Payjoin relay understands, and it's well specified. So any client that wants to do serverless Payjoin, relayed Payjoin, whatever it ends up being called, can agree that, okay, we can talk over this relay, and we're going to have encryption so that the server can't snoop, and some other, you can set some other requirements so that the server can't even do timing attacks. And that's why it's serverless, because you're not running a server and you're not really depending on, you're not trusting someone with your privacy.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Standardization and coming to agreement on what the relay is going to be that everybody uses is very important. And it's been encouraging to see like standards around like PSBTs get adopted by wallets too, which is, I was actually talking to Rob Hamilton earlier today and told him I was going to be discussing this with you and whether or not he had a question for you, and it revolved around like PSBTs, like how, if at all, are PSBTs involved in Payjoin or this infrastructure?
Before I answer that question, I want to say one thing about relays, which is people don't think about relays, but we use them all the time. And one of the standards that uses one that has just blown up is LNURL. LNURL uses a relay, so you can get a invoice whenever you want. And that one has just been huge for Lightning adoption and making it possible for people to receive without running a server all the time or being able to dedicate to a different service. But as far as Rob's question, PSBTs, the Payjoin protocol is really only two things. It's an interactive PSBT coordinator, and then it's the specific network packets that you send back and forth to agree on fees and prevent attacks. It's those two things: PSBT coordination and networking. The protocol is so simple, I can really just explain it in 3 steps. So the first step is you generate that address that includes your server URL. This is your Bitcoin URI with a Payjoin parameter. That's the receiver does that. Then the sender constructs a transaction as they would normally. I call this the fallback transaction that pays to the address the receiver sends. But instead of just broadcasting that transaction, they create a complete valid PSBT and they send that to the receiver's server that they specified. So the receiver gets that, and if nothing else happens, they can always broadcast that transaction. They always have valid money that's going to pay for whatever service. So because they have that, they're comfortable contributing inputs that the sender might not know about and returning a new PSBT with their inputs, and the outputs change to include the value of that input. So it's really two PSBTs that get sent back and forth, and that's it.
Yeah. And as you're describing that process, like how long does that take?
It's basically instant. It's just like sending a message. Sorry, I gotta plug in my computer here. I don't know what happened. I unplugged it, stepped on it.
It's
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Is it just takes as long as it takes to send a text message. As long as the server is online, you send a message and they respond.
And so like with that instantaneous interaction there, it's like driving my mind towards like how does the coin selection work on the receiver side in terms of UTXOs they're providing as the inputs? Is it random? Obviously, it's a hot wallet. They'll put particular UTXOs there. Is there like a coin selection algorithm in the background?
This is another thing PDK does that other implementations haven't. Until I think earlier this year, BTC Pay server wasn't picking random, but it was creating transactions that could sometimes be identified as possibly Payjoins. So there's this thing called unnecessary input heuristic, where you're putting more inputs into the transaction that are strictly necessary to create one of the outputs that's assumed to be the payment output. And there are different varieties of this. Some of them are identifiable as Payjoins, some of them not. So the receiver does have to be cognizant of which inputs they choose, and the PDK has a function that you can just call on your inputs that will construct a Payjoin, preserving your privacy that's not obviously a Payjoin transaction. And BTC Pay server does that now, but if you use PDK, you just call that function and it'll be like, okay, either use a fallback transaction or construct a good, safe, secure, privacy preserving Payjoin.
So how does it determine if it's good, safe, and secure?
So like if one of the inputs is obvious, there's a paper that came out last year that went into really great detail to identify these that we didn't know were identifiable. But I think it's like if there's a really big input and one of the outputs is also very large and the payment amount is trivial in comparison to that, then you can find out what the payment amount is. But if the inputs are relatively similarly sized and the payment is significant compared to those inputs, then it's more difficult to parse which one is the input and which one is the change. Or it's like less likely that if you make an assumption that the big input is also the big outputs owned by the big output, then because it makes it more difficult to make that assumption, or it's less likely that that assumption is true, you're said to preserve privacy.
So it's basically calculating something in the background that compares the payment that they're looking to receive with the UTXO that the sender's putting up, and then going using coin selection to find the UTXO that sort of make it very hard to figure out what the actual payment was.
Yeah, you choose an input so that one of these varieties of unnecessary input heuristic is not created. That's the idea. It's like a subset sum problem, so you have to make sure, because you can use more than one input, so it's like the subset of sender inputs and the subset of receiver inputs won't be associated together, and neither will the payment amount.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So what is the current state of PDK? Like obviously you just released the announcement blog post earlier this week. obviously been thinking about this for a while, and it's probably important to touch on something you mentioned in the blog post, which is you decide to make PDK separate from something like BDK for specific reasons. You did this intentionally. Like, why have a separate development kit and not just try to get this implemented into something like BDK?
Because it's a different thing, really. So PDK right now is, I'd say the sender is a late beta. So the sender works. It's been in the wild. It's been in Bitmask. It's been in Payjoin CLI. It's been in No Looking for quite some time, which are just different Payjoin apps. And the receiver is early beta. So the receiver works, but we need more extensive user testing before we can call it a version 1 and have the interface be concrete, say that we're pretty sure that the interface won't change. So that's the status of PDK. I really started working on Payjoin and Rust to have this idea of a kit where you could put it anywhere. So instead of having an application code where you need to use Wasabi, you need to use Samurai, you need to use Join Market, this can be drop in anywhere. And I was really lucky to get to work with Evan Lin, who works on BDK very closely when this was early, before he was granted by Spiral. So we were working on these Lightning Payjoins. And because he knew that so well, he understood that BDK is really a wallet software. Underneath that is this thing called Rust Bitcoin, which has been around for years and years. LDK uses it and BDK use it, but that's all the primitives. That's all the consensus details, the consensus data structures, where BDK manages the keys. BDK makes sure you're not spending the same UTXO multiple times without knowing it. It's doing some coin selection for you, and it manages output descriptors, whereas Payjoin is doing that PSBT negotiation and the networking. So right now, Will Owens is an awesome Summer of Bitcoin intern. He's being helped out by Steve Myers of BDK to get those together. One of the first integrations was with that Bitmask app. That's beta.bitmask.com. It's a great web wallet that uses Lightning and Bitcoin using LDK and BDK, and they even have RGB assets. So we proved that it could be used with BDK, and we're working on finding what's common between different BDK Payjoin combinations. So eventually I think it will be possible to have Payjoin as a feature flag in BDK, but there's always a little bit more work that needs to be done to include Payjoin in your app. And for that reason, I think it makes sense to have the focus be on the pure protocol, PSBT protocol. So that's really well tested. That's well understood. A lot of eyes are on that for that reason. And we can support that within BDK from that perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so senders been in beta for a while, receivers just getting beta. Like, what else? Like, what would make you happy in terms of the state of PDK? Like, in a form where you'd be proud to send it out into the wild and have it people begin implementing it into their software.
I'm proud of BDK. I'm proud of PDK already. I think the Rust implementation is suitable for people to implement and integrate, and people are doing it. We're certainly growing, and after putting the blog post out and getting support from the community, there have been a lot of interest. The reason my voice goes up at the end and I'm a little, I know it's not complete, is because it's still Rust. It's not possible to use in any language you want, or it's not easy. So we've got to work on bindings. And the cool thing about borrowing the architecture from LDK and BDK is that there's a bunch of people already working on a sort of canon way to think about bindings. So no matter what project you're using, you can be familiar with it. And we have some basic, Matthias from Trident has been working on Python bindings. Thunder Biscuit has been a great help to unify the bindings between multiple languages. And Michael from Boltz has been really helpful in helping set up a roadmap for what WASM bindings could look like for TypeScript and JavaScript. And once we have solid bindings, it's really possible to rely on all of the review and security that's gone into the sender and receiver. So knowing your implementation is spec'd right, knowing that coin selection algorithm is going to avoid the heuristics that are going to identify you as Payjoins, and still be able to directly plug in using whatever language you want.
Yeah, that seems pretty massive. And Thunder Biscuit just got a grant from Spiral or the HRF, correct, to focus on this full time?
Congrats to Thunder Biscuit. Yeah, he's been amazing. There's this thing called UniFFI from Mozilla that they use to write their password manager extensions once, and then they use it in their browsers, and they use it on all the different devices. So we're using, or Thunder Biscuit has let us to use the same UniFFI bindings technique, so we can write this library, security-focused library once, and plug it in everywhere. We don't have to worry about the security. It's a really good model. It's a secure model for this kind of software where people's sats are at stake.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's always blows my mind talking to individuals like you working on this, because sometimes personally I came into Bitcoin from like an economics perspective and got heavy into mining like 5 years ago. So in recent years I've been really focused on mining and just like the economic side of Bitcoin and its effects as a monetary good on the world. And it's always fun coming back and having conversations with people like you actually working on the protocol that make all this work and make it work better for individuals at the end of the day. So thank you for doing that. But I'd also like to, if you're successful, PDK is successful, when it is successful, again, confidently speaking here, when it's successful and it starts getting wider adoption in wallets. I know I've had this conversation in the past and it's really hard to tell, but or foresee, but how much adoption of Payjoin throughout the Bitcoin economy needs to happen before these common input ownership heuristics are completely borked.
I just got asked this question this morning. It's really great to talk with you as well. I've been listening to the pod for a long time. You've had the pulse just on Bitcoin for so long. So to get the questions that are they're at the core of the community, every facet of it. Everyone's asking these questions. So to get them all at once lined up is a great help for the Bitcoin community at large to understand what the heck is going on. When I think about getting it out there to the world at large, I think about Payjoin's role in all of these technologies. So you have Lightning, which is really for payments. And I heard Matt yesterday say, oh, if a store supports Lightning and Payjoin, of course, I'm just going to pay with Lightning. Obviously, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's well established. And, Payjoin has a way to go until it's effectively breaking the surveillance. And to that, I say to think about Payjoin as more of a settlement layer technology. So Lightning always settles on the main chain. You always have to make a new output to have a new channel. And that's where Payjoin really comes in. It's about batching those settlements. Even when a receiver receives a very basic transaction, when they take that Payjoin, the best time to do that is when a fee market is low, because they're doing a consolidation, so that in a high fee market environment, high block space market environment, they can make a transaction with just one input instead of two. So anytime you're doing settlement, having the option to Payjoin and having that option ideally decided for you by software that's making predictions will save money over the long haul. As far as when it becomes effective, it's effective immediately. So if you're making Payjoins and some of your transactions are Payjoins and someone watching you knows that, then for all of those Payjoin transactions, the common input ownership heuristic is wrong. Their assumption that they'd make is just wrong. As it becomes more widespread, then any transaction they look at could have that likelihood to be a Payjoin. So the example I gave in Discord this morning was, say you don't know any information about the people you're tracking, but 5% of transactions break common input ownership heuristic. Let's say 5% of transactions are Payjoins. There are other transactions or other reasons people make transactions that don't conform with that heuristic, but let's say they're Payjoins. Then if someone were following your transaction in isolation, they would say, okay, I have a 95% probability that these inputs are both owned by the same person. And then if they have another transaction, they have that probability again. So as these are chained together, they're all independent variables, then the probability that they can follow some input to its output goes down substantially. If you have one 95% chance probability times another 95% chance probability, it just gets weaker and weaker as time goes on. So you don't need that much to make tracking Bitcoin over a few different transactions very unreliable.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so at that point, like a chain surveillance company wouldn't have confidence in whether or not you control certain UTXOs. They may still have confidence about other individuals not engaged in Payjoin transactions outside of that. But there's a point. Sorry, there's a plane flying above me now. This is the back porch studios. Always fun. But is there a point where, actually, I don't know. I think my assumption is it's isolated to people in Payjoin transactions, the privacy that's provided them. Like, is there any critical tipping point where, say, like 50% of the network is engaged in Payjoin transactions, the other 50% is afforded benefits of that individual privacy people transacting in the Payjoin fashion are getting?
This is a question I really wish I had a better grasp of, because of course the surveillance companies act like they know exactly what's going on. That's how they make money. They tell people, oh, we know we can track with certainty, but I don't know where the hammer falls on that. Where I think we'll find out in this Bitfog case how reliable the public thinks this tech is. But if someone analyzing your history knows you use Payjoin or knows that the wallet you use supports it, then they can really no longer make that assumption. So you get that safety just by having your wallet support it, even if you're not using it, especially because it's something that is automatic in terms of user experience. Is not something you have to opt into really and manually do as a sender, and even as a receiver with serverless Payjoin. So if wallets support it, you have that assumption across the board. And then even if someone can't identify what wallet you're using, say you're just using something that supports newer technology like SegWit or Taproot, then there probably is a chance, at least after an exchange pays you, that you could be using a wallet supporting Payjoin, and these common input heuristics used to track you aren't really valuable anymore.
Yeah, the Bitfog case will be very interesting. What worries me about that case is it's becoming pretty clear that it seems like chain analysis is they're basically over advertising their abilities. But you could see a case where, God damn it, a helicopter coming right over me. Give me a second.
Technology. I'm really curious what a jury will be convinced of is in that case, because that's what it's going to come down to, is how the experts that everyone looks to trust can convince a jury. And I think it's pretty obvious that their techniques aren't perfect, that there is a chance that every step along the way, even without Payjoin, has a high degree of ambiguity and could not be what they're saying it is. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, and that's like the conversation I've been having in my mind too, because you could see a case where the jury has no idea what's going on. They could convict this gentleman, I forget his name off the top of my head, with bad information. And then chain analysis can continue to use those bad techniques to just essentially buddy up with the government to throw people they don't like in jail. But at the end of the day, on chain, like really, like the truth is they don't actually know what's going on. It's like, what? Like, is that a silver lining to all this? Like, it's weird that chain analysis and the government can go bully people and throw them in jail with bad information. But we also have the knowledge that the truth of the situation is that they actually can't identify people on the chain. I don't know if I'm articulating this correctly, but do you see?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely can throw people in jail, unfortunately, before a trial. This dude is in jail. He is suffering. But I do have faith in the American justice system. I like to think I do, that even if it got through one jury trial, at some point there's an appeals process, and it's quite plain that what they're doing is heuristic analysis. They're making assumptions to come to a conclusion about what someone did or did not do. And this is, I mean, all law enforcement is heuristic analysis. If you're dressed up wearing a nice shirt, if you have a particular ethnic background, it tends to be the outcome of a traffic stop might be different for you than someone else, but that doesn't necessarily mean the justice system, when all is said and done, will not be able to see through that.
Yeah, it's fascinating times. So you seem pretty passionate about this right to privacy, particularly as you transact with Bitcoin. Like, do you see a potential timeline where Bitcoin, maybe it doesn't fail, but isn't as successful as it potentially could be due to a lack of privacy assurances for individuals?
The biggest issue with privacy in financial markets to me is that the people that censor, that make the decisions of what's okay and what's not, are not necessarily elected. They're not chosen through a democratic process, and they can be there for a long time. So I think markets would be better off for people to not have the opportunity to bully others and make rules without being elected and being held accountable. And Bitcoin gives me a lot of hope that that's possible. The fact that this privacy issue was left in the white paper is exciting to me, because it's like, oh, nice. Satoshi gave us some directions into what's possible, what we can fix. It gives me something to do. So there's one line, I think there's one section about privacy in the white paper, which talks about common input ownership heuristic. Satoshi says, if some inputs are spent in a transaction, then they can be assumed to come from the same person, even though addresses are pseudonymous, and you can get a degree of anonymity by receiving payments using a fresh address. So because we can Payjoin, because we can make these transactions using interaction that break that heuristic, we can bust that last open privacy problem. Like, it's a long path ahead, and it will be iterative, but I have faith that it's possible to solve the problem. And it's not so much that I think Bitcoin would fail because it didn't have privacy. To me, it's more a matter of when it happens. That is the thing that's holding adoption back. Like, the reason people like gold and hold it in their treasuries is because they have the rock. They know they have the rock. They know no one saw them receive the rock. And I think that's possible for Bitcoin, and that's going to make it grow when it's possible. And people are going to have a lot more eyes and trust in the system when they know it has that. Because when people say, oh, Bitcoin's private, I think a lot of people know that's BS. It's just not they get intuitively that that can't be the case. But if you can prove that's the case, people will be a lot more comfortable to use Bitcoin, and it'll allow it to be far more widespread.
Agreed. And that's why I'm really excited about what you're working on too, because there's a lot of people who believe that Bitcoin can never attain a sufficient level of privacy assurances without upgrading to something like confidential transactions or zero knowledge proofs. Like, we'd need a massive protocol upgrade to get the privacy that people really want at the end of the day. And I'd never believe that to be true due to the fact that CoinJoin exists and things like Payjoin exist. It's just more effort that's needed on the software side of things to make the user experience such that people are using Bitcoin and coin selection and PSBTs with multiple inputs smartly.
I see no reason you couldn't coordinate a Payjoin that involved more than two individuals. I think you could get the CoinJoin process where multiple people contribute and where you have ambiguity from payments in the user experience of scan a QR or share your address URI with someone to signal your intent. And then the result of that is a transaction that, like Payjoin, doesn't stick out as something weird. It just looks like a batch and gives you the unlinkability from your inputs and outputs to the point where even the person you're paying doesn't know what input you paid with, which they do in Payjoin version 1.
Yeah, so let's flesh that out. How would like a multi-receiver Payjoin work?
When the time comes, I'll release some in-depth documents, but I think it could work with a coordinator. You could use an eCash system. This is what like Max Hillebrand has suggested on the mailing list in the past, where you register inputs and outputs, and then somehow you split those outputs based on the other inputs and outputs. So there's a degree of ambiguity. How that all comes together, how it fits within the QR code paradigm is yet to be seen, but I'm convinced it's possible.
Why are you convinced it's possible?
Because all the basic tech is there. You really just need a way to coordinate. It's a matter of sending enough messages and blinding the sensitive information, and we know how to do both of those things.
Yeah. So just more time needed to be spent on this problem to actually figure out how to.
Yeah, you need engineering resources. You need smart minds. You need people who collaborate, and you need people who don't give up on the problem.
Yeah, that actually brings up a good point. It's something I've had discussions with some core devs over the last year, particularly like this concept of like burnout, particularly within Bitcoin Core. Like, what are your thoughts on the state of just developing on Bitcoin right now? It seems like there is a fair amount of burnout, and with Core specifically, it's really hard to get stuff done. It tends to frustrate people.
I think it's actually getting better than it has been. I think we had a low point between the bear market and legal trolls, but we're seeing more and more support in the world of grants. I think we're seeing people be quite generous and realize the need. And I think because it's financial technology, the companies that rely on it are more likely to support it than they are plain data or networking open source stuff. Because their money is secured on it, they can say, okay, we can spend this % of our budget to make sure it's secure by supporting the people whose responsibility it is to secure this thing. So I'm optimistic in that regard. I know a lot of people, it's really difficult. It's been difficult for me to get grants. Of course, I'm not like super well funded. I've sacrificed a lot to be able to work on Bitcoin and persevere through tough times with it. It's not easy to maintain this kind of development when you're not, venture backed or working for a megacorp who's paying your salary. And those opportunities are super appealing, especially before the past year. To go and work at Facebook the year you graduate and make 300 grand a year just a couple years later is super appealing. I understand why people want to do it. And the other thing about the grant programs that I would like to call for change for is I think a lot of these programs focus very solely on nonprofit, which is different from Syncoin land. I think a lot of the grants are conditional on, okay, you're not going to make any money doing this, and that makes projects that are unsustainable. Like even if you had a nonprofit, it is not necessarily a bad thing that makes money to sustain the project. In fact, I think that's what you want to encourage. I think you want to encourage business models that work. That way, those business models can support more and more development, and you get a spiral upward. So I hope that can change. I hope some of these grant giving organizations can say, okay, just because there's a business model associated with this does not mean it's ineligible for funding. And in fact, that could solve the problem that we keep running into where our grant money runs out at the end of a year because this person's work is expensive and is not sustainable without continuous donations.
What are some examples of like projects that could make money that aren't getting grants?
One really good one that's succeeded is the Bolts Exchange, Atomic Swaps. That's been like a huge success story, I think, is that got some support from Human Rights Foundation. It's not like huge support, of course, but they're able to turn that into a real business that at least can sustain. I don't want to get into, stuff that hasn't been funded because I don't want to complain. I think by and large, all of the granting has been overwhelmingly positive, directed in precisely the right direction. I don't think much of it has been misguided at all. I think the people giving these grants are making very good decisions and supporting the developers that need it. I just ask that they, consider to open their mind a little more.
Yeah, I think that's a fair ask. Makes a lot of sense. And technology is important. Like you mentioned it, like it's been hard for you, but what keeps you going? Like
it's meaningful, man. I feel like I'm doing something that can help people, and I see a light at the end of the tunnel. We're working on Bitcoin. Like I'm not working on some esoteric zoology that really requires this constant funding to sustain. We're working on Bitcoin. We're working on financial markets. Expanding knowledge into this realm is worth something tangible. So I can keep going. It's not a problem.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I think it's extremely important. And I'm very happy.
It's fun. Everyone in this has very high, well, not literally everyone, but I think on average, the people that I work with in Bitcoin have a high degree of humility and collaboration. Being able to work on network protocols in particular, where so much of the culture is inspired by this idea of rough consensus and decentralization, is really easy to fall in love with. It's just fun.
Yeah. And you mentioned you see the light at the end of the tunnel, so I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but stoked a question in my mind is like, obviously there's always going to be the need to do maintenance on the protocol, but are there like a few things that are in the docket that may or may not get merged into Bitcoin or added to the areas above the protocol layer that, if added and merged, would get Bitcoin to a state that you think is okay to run sort of at that state into perpetuity?
I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean. I see some sort of change that's coming that's going to make Bitcoin private, or are you talking about something else?
Like just in general, like if we got, like some people think, like if we get L2 and a couple other upgrades, like Bitcoin at the protocol level, at least we'll be at a place where it's like, all right, this is good enough. Like if we had ossification, like this would be okay. Is there a combination of things like that in your mind that if the protocol were to get to, you'd be like, all right, this is pretty robust, pretty resilient.
I don't know. I focus very narrowly on the privacy problem sometimes, where I feel like I'm missing things that are happening on the mailing list or at the protocol level. It seems like there's a lot in terms of P2P privacy that's happening that I'm really excited for. And probably my optimism comes from support like this of PDK and the idea that Payjoin can make a real difference, and some of the research I've done that convinces me that we can get reliable privacy in Bitcoin at a systems level instead of just with specific applications. Like that mindset, I think, is really what changed it more than anything, because when we were all focused on use this application, get privacy, I just never saw how that could expand to all of Bitcoin. But thinking of protocols like Lightning and Payjoin as kind of like in the operating system model, when you're doing systems programming, you think of the operating system and then you have drivers on top of that to use your peripherals, which are kind of, to run your audio and whatnot. And I think of Lightning and Payjoin and other systems like device drivers. You're not using a device necessarily, but it gives you a feature. And because they're engineered to be systems that run in all these different wallet softwares, they become ubiquitous. And I think we're getting to a point with privacy where I see that as becoming possible. And that's where my optimism comes from, is like this systems perspective rather than the application's perspective.
Hell yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And for anybody listening right now that wants to help push PDK forward, maybe contribute, where should we send them?
PayjoinDevKit.com. Sorry, PayjoinDevKit.org is the place to go first. Yeah, I know. I don't even know my own URL. So the GitHub and the Discord are linked there. We're on Twitter too as PayjoinDevKit.org. If you want just an overview of Payjoin, Payjoin.org is that. We're quite consistent in Discord. There's a bunch of different projects you can get involved in. So there are a couple designers. Shout out to Bob Space for supporting this work and being willing to collaborate. And BDK, of course, is Steve Myers and Summer of Bitcoin are doing a huge help to get PDK out there. And then if you want it in your specific application, the bindings are growing. And if we can work with you to get a implementation into your wallet, there's a number of people who are willing to get that done.
What are the top wallets on your list to get it implemented in?
I mean, whatever Bull Bitcoin's developing, that is on the way. We've got some drafts for that. And I think getting in an exchange is going to really change the game. Bolts is another kind of receiver exchange that could be super functional and helpful. The BDK CLI, of course. I think, I don't know who wants to step up to add serverless Payjoin first. There are a few people, of course, like the people I mentioned, that are willing, but as far as large scale rollouts, it's hard to say who's going to be first. Even Voltage has, because of the Lightning Payjoin, they've reached out and talked about, okay, if we can introduce this in the dashboard and you can just fund with a Payjoin, that's so much easier than, opening all these channels separately. They could just open the inbound channel and the batched outbound channels you wanted in one funding transaction. So yeah, I get kind of overwhelmed with all the different places this could go.
Yeah. What could go wrong with the serverless implementation?
The serverless implementation, I think the biggest risk is that we build something with either too many dependencies or that's too inflexible, so people don't want to integrate it. And I think this is what's happened with some of the ones I mentioned previously, like where you have a spec and it works and it's great and people that use it love it, but it only works with one application. So getting that early feedback, which I've gotten a lot of, fortunately, I've gotten a lot of collaboration. People want this, is critical to having a successful rollout. And I think that's what the BIP process is for. It gives you a clear way to post on the mailing list first, get people like Marty to scratch their head and say what's turn and want to talk about it, and then get other developers to come in and say that's wrong, don't do that, this might be a better idea, and come to that rough consensus where you can address everyone's concerns, build implementations, test it out, and have something that's robust and future proof.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, keep crushing it, dude. This is awesome. Very very excited and feel fortunate that an individual like yourself has dedicated their life to solving this problem. Because like I said earlier, I think it's a big problem to solve and would do the world a lot of good if it is solved. So thank you.
Thank you. It's happening. We're winning.
We are winning. We're not going to win. We're winning. We just got to keep winning. As we always have been. We always have been winning. It just doesn't always seem like it.
That's the truth.
So Dan, thank you. We will hopefully we can do this again. And there's more to talk about when this is widely adopted throughout the space. I'd love to do like a group discussion with you and Francis. Because I love Francis, number one, and number two, I think he's underrated in terms of like how he's thought about the infrastructure of his exchange and all the stuff that he's built and open sourced for others to leverage. And I think, like you said, Bolt Bitcoin getting in this and like adding it to their stack, their open source stack, could be massive for people.
I think other exchanges could see what's possible when someone takes a chance. And Francis has been on the Payjoin bug for a long time. I think the tech is just catching up. But all the potentials you mentioned, yeah, I'm interested. It sounds awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, you go enjoy your 4th of July weekend. I'm going to go do the same. And I guess I'll see you on the internet.
Thanks, Marty. See you on the internet.
All right. See you, Dan. Peace and love, freaks.